Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tonellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by HarperCollins Australia. Today, listeners, I want to tell you about an Australian author whose work I first became aware of back in 2022 with the release of her tender and moving memoir called 27 Letters to My Daughter. Written by Ella Ward, who worked in advertising for many years and whose work has been published in places like Frankie, Marie Claire and the Sydney Morning Herald, this was a brave, poignant and inspiring work about mothering and about life when faced with the prospect of dying. So imagine my delight when I found out that Ella had written a novel. Released in January of 2025, Ella's debut is called The Cicada House, and to say that I was captivated by this extraordinarily beautiful, magical novel would be to barely scratch the surface of how I felt about it. For me, it was the time traveller's wife meets an old movie called Just Like Heaven, based on a book titled If Only It Were True, meets another movie called About Time, written for the screen by Richard Curtis. Set between London and the fictional Victorian town of Arana Bay, this is a book that will take you on a magical, unexpected and delightful journey. And Ella is with me here today to tell us more about how she came to be writing this special story. Welcome to the podcast, Ella.
Thanks, Claudine. That's the nicest intro. You filled up my bucket to overflowing. I appreciate that. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, I'm delighted to be talking to you. And first off, I want to say congratulations. How are you feeling about the release of The Cicada House?
Thank you. I am feeling, honestly, quite tired. But in the most happy way, because as you said, this is my first novel but second book, and it's been a completely different process this time. And it has just been it's a real cliche, but it's been a true whirlwind of sort of PR and reactions. And I'm just bathing in it, sometimes drowning, but mostly happily bathing.
As you mentioned, this was a slightly different process, and your memoir came from an emotional and purposeful place, and you were recording things for your daughter you thought you may not be able to deliver in person. But I mean, was the writing process different for the Cicada House?
Totally different. I mean, it was night and day. So with 27 letters, it felt, because I was drawing on a series of other texts, I mean, those texts were my own family members' diaries, so it wasn't exactly academic, but it still felt like a bit more of an essay, a bit more of a sort of a university sort of history process, whereas this Cicada House was just about going to that magical imagination place and just rolling storylines out. So it felt completely different and really fresh and deeply enjoyable. It was a true pleasure to write.
Well, as I said, it was an absolute pleasure to read, and I could feel that in the writing of this book. Things that are easy to read are hard to write. So I was very interested to know how you felt about writing it, and to know that you felt pleasure in writing it is immensely satisfying.
I loved it. And even when we got to edits and, you know, the lovely team at HarperCollins were giving me feedback, it felt, even at its most challenging point, the way I used to describe it to my husband, Tom, is I feel like I'm sort of walking around with a couple of little niggly knots of thread in my head. And even when I'm working, because I work 4 days a week in advertising, and even when I'm mothering and even when I'm cooking, I felt like I was always just sort of fiddling at those knots, which could be distracting. But when you finally undo it and it finally comes free, the sense of satisfaction and then excitement about what that unlocks is just brilliant. So yeah, even if it's at its most challenging point, it was still hugely pleasurable.
Oh, I love that. Just love it. So I've given a bit of a clue in my introduction about the flavour of this story, but I wondered, Ella, if you could tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so I loved the references that you provided, because they're definitely in the wheelhouse of the book. And the book is, in its core, a bit of a love story and a bit of a late coming of age. I mean, there is this sort of thread that runs through the book that's all about turning 40. And our protagonist, Caitlin, we open on the day of her 40th birthday. She's standing in the glow of the refrigerator in her undies eating cheese, because that's the sort of person she is. And so it's a coming of age later in life, and that feeling of sort of falling in love with someone, but maybe also falling in love with yourself for the first time. But then, as you've sort of said, and it says it on the cover too, there is definitely an element of magic to this book. And I love coming across books or texts or films that feel like one story and then have a little sprinkle of wonder and magic in them. And so I wanted that in the book that I was writing, because the brief I gave myself is write the book that you want to read. And I think it's taken a few people by surprise. I think that people have picked up the book feeling like they're going to get a 40-something woman goes on a holiday, has a holiday romance, that's the end of the story. And then it's not that at all. But I am really appreciating how open people are to the fact that their genre has been slightly skewed without their permission, and how they've sort of enjoyed that process, because it is there, but my intention was that it doesn't take over the story and it doesn't take over the book.
Indeed. On my arc, the cover says it starts the way you would expect a story of this nature to start, but it takes you somewhere completely different. And I think that's at its heart what I loved so much about it. Even though I loved all of those additional elements in of themselves, I would read a book that had those, that they were defined by those characteristics. But the fact that you've kind of mixed this all up has just made it the most delightful surprise story I've ever read.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I love the idea of predictability. I don't poo-poo it at all. I think that, we all have a part of ourselves that want to settle into a book or a film and know how it's going to end. And that's great. And in some ways, there are elements of that in this book, but I also love being surprised. And I love feeling like I've clocked a character and knowing exactly what's going to happen, and then the opposite occurs. And so I wanted to just try my hand at that. I mean, I've never written a novel before, so it was all throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what stuck.
So, Ella, I wondered if you could tell us how you came to be writing this story. What were your main sources of inspiration?
This is when you start to realize that I'm quite nuts, and also probably deeply irritating, because there are so many other authors that I've met along this process of coming to a new vocation later in life. I'm 43. I started writing my first book when I was just before 40. And I really felt like it was I don't like the word journey, but I felt like, as I touched on before, I wanted to write something that I wanted to read. And also, I love the idea of coming up with strange and wonderful daydreams to help me get through difficult times. So I have really bad anxiety, and I've had high functioning anxiety disorder since I can remember. And, I have a great relationship with my psychiatrist. I have lots of other things that are sort of tools that I use. But one of the tools that has been in my arsenal for a very long time is almost disassociating through a completely magical fantasy. So whether it's, if I'm in bed and I can't sleep, I'm thinking, okay, let's just imagine I'm on a holiday, maybe I'm on an island, and I'm going to meet a really famous movie star. I basically am telling myself bedtime stories. Or, I used to be quite afraid of flying. And so I'd sit there and I'd go through in my head, okay, I just want you to imagine in great amounts of detail what you would do if you won $60 million. And this ability to switch my brain off and turn it onto something else meant that when I started to talk to Catherine Milne, who's the head of fiction at HarperCollins, about my, idea for a novel, I just went to those places of things that feel escapist and feel warm and safe. And I thought, well, how would I take some of those themes and write them into a book?
Wow. Okay. That's incredible. And I love that. Let's talk about Caitlin. As you said, we meet her on the day that she's turned 40 and she's in her underwear and she's eating cheese. Who inspired her?
You've spoken to so many amazing authors. Surely every single author, for every single character, it begins as a kernel of themselves. I remember hearing something, I probably heard it at high school, and it's probably absolute bunkum, like it probably is complete rubbish. But I do remember someone telling me once that in a dream, when you dream, every single character in your dream is a version of yourself. And that's like a theory of dream interpretation. So the monster is you, the romantic side is you, the little child is you, So this is a theory. And I feel that way about writing as well. I think that every character is obviously inspired by many different people around you, but there has to always be a really core element of yourself. So the most extreme sides of Caitlin, she's extremely antisocial to the point where, she's almost a hermit. She's nowhere interested in going out and seeing anyone or doing anything. That's a little bit of me. And the fact that she can be a bit spiky, be a bit cynical, that's a little bit of me too. So I think, honestly, the initial parts of her were inspired by myself. But then I started to really build that out and thought, well, what would it be like to be an orphan? Caitlin's mother died when she was 5 and she never knew her father. What would it be like to be brought up by your grandparents and have them be quite papery and old and dusty and not very emotional? And then what would it be like to be married to somebody who's maybe continued on that thread and has always filled the space that you yourself is not filling? So none of those things have anything whatsoever to do with me. But I liked the idea of starting with a kernel of truth and then stretching it into a space that I've never experienced and using my imagination.
Yes, I have spoken to lots of people, and many of whom have said, yeah, maybe there's a little bit of me in there. But I have to say that's probably the most honest answer I've ever received.
Well, the one thing I will always guarantee, Claudine, is complete honesty gets me into a lot of trouble a lot of the time. As they say, yeah, there's nothing braver than a woman who no longer cares what other people think. So I don't think I'm quite there yet, but I'm certainly on my way. And honesty is a fair way to take you there.
You said that, she is a little bit antisocial and I think she's at a period in her life where she's clearly in a funk. Her marriage is stale, but not in a way that she would have recognized as lacking in any way. She was accepting of her situation. And I'm not sure if you would agree with this, but kind of unaware that there was anything wrong. And so when her husband leaves her, she's completely unprepared.
That's very insightful of you, and you're absolutely spot on. I think it's a really important delineation between being unhappy but not knowing you're unhappy. Obviously, as I've gotten older, I've become surrounded by more people who are coming to these sorts of realizations in their lives. And I think it actually is more common than not to be in a bad spot, but not know it was bad until you look back on it. My mum has been through a few divorces. She's extremely happily married and has been for decades now. But, back in the past, and she was always very open with me about what, the ending of a marriage could feel like. And then also a few of my friends have gone through the same thing. And what people say is that, I didn't actually realize how bad it was until I looked back. I thought I was fine. And it's that whole, frog in the boiling water. It's just things change so gradually over such a long period of time that unless you are almost sort of psychopathic in how you're constantly checking in and refreshing and self-evaluating, and people can't do that all the time because they have lives to lead and jobs to do and families to bring up. So it is quite common, I think, much more common than even I was expecting when I started to ask around about divorce and the ending of relationships, how common it is for it to happen so seemingly out of the blue, but then once it's occurred, to look back on that and go, oh, the cracks were appearing years ago.
So when this happens, this kind of like sparks the beginning of something very different for Caitlin. She starts to become a little bit more aware. And obviously she inherits this money from her grandmother. It helps her escape her job and also her husband. And she ends up in this regional, Victorian town of Arana Bay. Now, I know you live in Melbourne, so I wondered if there was a place that perhaps you'd visited that served as inspiration for this town.
Absolutely, yeah. There's about, a couple of hours out of Melbourne along the Bellarine Peninsula, there's a little town called Point Lonsdale, and I've grown up visiting there. My grandparents bought a house there in the 70s when it was mainly just fibro shacks and one petrol station, and it hasn't really grown since then. And Arana Bay is much more basic than Point Lonsdale, or Lonnie, as people call it is. And so it's definitely a completely fictional town. But the elements of Point Lonsdale that are sort of sewn into my soul, like the smell, the sound of walking along the paths, what it smells like for the eucalypt combined with the salt, combined with the feeling of the heat, the sounds of the, cicadas and things like that. That's all Point Lonsdale. And I have literally been visiting the same town, walking the same roads since I was born. And so to be able to take that I guess it's almost like a physical memory of a place, and then lift it up and then lay it over a much more remote, much less, it's not developed at all. There's one general store. To lay those memories over a fantasy town or location was the best intersection of sort of fact and fiction for me.
This is one of the most remarkable aspects of the book, and it's how you manage to evoke not just such a strong sense of place, but you also give Caitlin so many sensory experiences which serve to illustrate the stark contrast of her life in London, which was grey and wet and soggy, I guess, and then the life that she begins to make for herself here in Australia. So literally her senses awaken. She sees the vibrant colours of the landscape. She smells the trees, the earth, the ocean, and consequently, so do we as readers. And I think at one point she even says something like her eyes even look like a different colour in Australia than they do back in England. So clearly you were very conscious and very deliberate about this when writing, Caitlin, surely.
Yes, and I lived in England for nearly 5 years in my 20s, as you know, many Australians have. But during that time, you know, my mum was married and my brother turned 18. So there were a couple of reasons for me to come back to Australia much more quickly than sort of I would have planned. And so, you know, I ended up bouncing between London and Melbourne quite a few times in that period. And I think that juxtaposition between winter in London, summer in Melbourne, going from a little grey basement flat when, you know, things were tricky. Things are always tricky when you've got no money and you're in your first job in your 20s in a new city. And then, you know, I still remember now getting out of the airport at Tullamarine in Melbourne. And no matter what time of year it was, no matter what time of day it was, the smell of just Melbourne. And this is at an airport where really what you're smelling is sort of car exhaust, and the smell shimmers. I think because I had these really formative years comparing the senses between two cities, it's something that's really never left me. And I really wanted to show that and demonstrate how that can often reflect what's going on the inside.
You were talking about your time in Lonnie and the fact that your grandparents had owned that house and you were visiting them. So Caitlin's relationship with her grandparents is especially important in this book. As you mentioned, they raised her when her mother died young, and her approach to life is very much dictated by the stoic never complain, never explain edict, which has been passed down to her from her grandmother. Why was exploring this dynamic in the book important to you?
It's a really good question. I haven't thought about it like that. I think that I liked the idea of a strong female presence being in Caitlin's life, but also almost a shadow of that presence. So her mother died, she can barely remember her mother, and then her grandmother has clearly died in their sort of last 10, sort of 12 years. So she doesn't actually have any more female mentors or family members around her. And she does constantly cast back to Dot, her nan's sort of, as you say, you know, she's got these little sayings, you know, nothing in life happens that's worth anything until the year after 40, and never explain, never complain, and, you know, all these sorts of tuts and noises. And even though we never really meet Dot properly, we sort of almost feel like we know her because she lives in Caitlin's head. I guess if I'm going to be technical about it, as a way to further the story, it gives Caitlin something to anchor on, and it gives us an understanding of where this brittleness and this sharpness has come from. But it also allows Caitlin to sort of come up against that and almost have an argument with her grandma in her head, because for most of the story, we almost see her grandma as a bit of a villain. You know, she was clearly quite cold. I think there's a line in the story quite early on where, you know, she looked after Caitlin because she had to. You know, that's what happens if your only child dies and their child comes to you. Of course, you're going to look after them. But how you do that, unfortunately, depends on many other factors. So I liked the idea of her being the villain and then slowly unpicking and sort of taking layer and layer off and realizing that no one's actually ever just the villain or just the hero. And there's always going to be a lot of grey area in between.
By the end of the story, she sees her grandfather in a different light too, because she certainly casts him in one role, just like she does Dot. She casts him in
Mm.
one role and then, thinks that she knows him, but in fact, she doesn't really know him at all.
Absolutely. And isn't that what getting older is? It's as we become closer in age to the parents that we thought we knew when we were teenagers and in our early 20s, which I think is such an iconic moment of sort of it almost becomes frozen in your mind. As I was actually saying to someone just yesterday, it's funny, like if you ever say to me, what's the best book you've ever read, what's the best song you've ever heard, my first instinct is to go back to what I felt like when I was 21, because that's when you're growing as a human, and that's when you're coming of age. And for me, when I think about my parents and my grandparents, the time that I'm most fixed on them is when I was 21. And so as you get older and you're realizing who your parents actually were, because you're starting to understand them more. And my mum teases me because there's an old quote by an female American poet, and it's a poem all about parenting and becoming understanding of your parents and your children. And one of the lines is, as you get older, your mother understands you. She relentlessly understands you. And it's so true. It's like, oh gosh, she understands me so well. And that's what happens as we get older and we start to realize that we're just like our parents.
We talked a little bit earlier about your memoir. And in that memoir, you've got sort of lots of life lessons that you want to pass on to your daughter. And I feel like a lot, or maybe some of the characteristics and lessons that you gave to Caitlin in this book were based on some of the life lessons that you talked about in your memoir. One of these was, don't let self-awareness turn into self-flagellation, which, if I'm not mistaken, is something Caitlin's new friend Erin in Arana Bay tells her when she starts to tell Erin the story of her life. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and what this meant for Caitlin's, for want of a better word, journey in this book.
That's such a good question, Claudine. You're so clever. Yes, I think that it has become quite, fashionable is the wrong word. It's become quite common for women in particular, of a certain age, my age, in a certain stage of life, to beat yourself up and to talk about it goes from self-deprecating to self-flagellation. I really stuffed this up and I was terrible at this. And then that's when I failed that. And I should have done this with this job. And I should have done this with this child. And yes, a degree of self-awareness is extremely important. And, anyone who's actually worked with me or for me knows that's one of my sort of key focuses as a manager is like, you've got to be self-aware because it is a bit of a superpower. But I think that women in particular feel sometimes that they need to counter that self-awareness with a negativity. And sometimes that is charming or disarming because you're honest and you're being the opposite of arrogant, you're being so humble. But sometimes, and we've all met people like this, maybe sometimes we've been people like this, that sense of being humble and that sense of being self-aware really turns into something else. And you wonder, and I know this because I've done this sometimes, and I also have come across it, you wonder how much of that self-awareness is turning into self-pity, which is then also turning into something that's really just asking for someone's forgiveness or really just an excuse. And so I thought that was a really interesting thing to explore, and particularly because two women are having that conversation, and it's a really honest conversation, and it's quite harsh. I don't think I've ever really had a female or any friendship where I've been that brutal or that honest and open with them, but I love the idea that it exists. I think that sisters, I've got much younger sisters. I don't have any sisters sort of my age, and maybe sisters might have a conversation that is that honest. Probably the closest I've had is probably a conversation with my mum, because mum and I are very close. But yeah, I loved exploring that sense of self-awareness versus self-flagellation. And sometimes, it's basically, you've got to pull yourself up, be aware.
I wondered if you could tell us more about these life lessons in your memoir and where they came from. There's so many of them and they're all so incredible.
My poor kid, she's like, oh God, Mum, shut up. 27 Letters to My Daughter started as a very private project because I was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer when I was 36. And so my daughter was a new preppy. As anyone can imagine, it was a really frightening time. And because I do have a tendency for the melodramatic, Claudine, even though no one had actually told me I was going to die, they all said very nice things like, this is treatable and we're going to get through this, and all the other things that you want to hear from your, oncologist. I was still in a state, and, I don't really apologize for that. I think that anyone would sort of be in a state, but I probably took it one step further than most people. And I started to think, I have to write letters for her. I have to leave some legacy. I became almost quite obsessed with it. And I started the project, and it was unsurprisingly much too painful at that time. And so I sort of set it aside. And then it wasn't until I found the beginnings of those letters, 3 or 4 years later, that I started to sort of play around with them, because I wasn't coming necessarily from that point of that abject fear. So as I started to write these letters to her, some of the letters were, funny, and some were emotional, but I really liked the idea of lessons that we often get from our elders, whether they're parents or friends. They very rarely come to us packaged up in beautiful, creamy envelopes with handwritten script and a beginning and a middle and an end. Often the lessons you get that you remember, so I certainly do, are the ones that are sort of thrown at you, I don't know, like over a stove in the middle of Christmas Day, and your mum says, you always got to put the flour in before the butter, something like that. Or when you're in the supermarket, and that it's like, when you're really young and your mum's showing you, or your dad's showing you how to get the right supermarket trolley that doesn't have the skew-if wheel. And so when you're reading 27 letters, yes, there are 27 letters, but throughout, it's literally just lesson, 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 lesson. And that's sort of, I think, what I wanted to replicate, was that sense that sometimes something is very meaningful and has a lot of detail and context. And other times it's your crazy aunt telling you, always keep a pair of tweezers in your car, because that's when you're going to be able to get the best light to do your eyebrows.
Now, that is one lesson that I have passed on to my daughter. I have to tell you, we always have tweezers in the car.
It's amazing. No matter what you do, you're never going to be replicate that perfect light. So just lean into it and make sure the tweezers are in the car.
Now, Ella, the time traveling aspect of this novel is superbly executed. It's definitely on the woo-woo side of the storytelling spectrum. So what drew you to this theme and thread in the story?
Oh, it's such a daggy answer. I really love time traveling. I just love it as a concept. I've grown up loving it. I must have been an early book that I probably read well before I was starting to form proper memories, because it's something that I've always found fascinating as a subject. And, I'm not a huge sci-fi fan, but I've definitely grown up reading, there's a great book from the 70s called Time and Again, which is just really explores it. And I really love, I'm not so fussed about the science side of things, which is, as you can probably tell when you read the book, because I just completely ignore that. But I love the idea of, what would it mean? What would it feel like? What would it be about to remove yourself from one context and put you in another? And at its most simple, when you take any of the woo-woo out of it, it's really just a perspective change. And it's a method of, I guess, to coin a phrase that's quite common these days, is it's reframing. So it's about reframing your experience. And, again, this is sort of probably from my mum. She used to play a game with me and my brother, which was, I guess, a time traveling game, but it was really, looking back, it was an opportunity to sort of get us to focus on what was going on around us. And she'd often say, okay, we're driving in the car. I want you to imagine that you are from 5 years ago, and you're going to pop into your eyes and into this body just for 5 seconds. And what cues could you pick up as to how old you are, where you are, what's happening, and things like that. And so suddenly it would turn a really boring car journey into something that was really interesting, because we'd be saying, oh my God, we'd look at, like, we could see you, but you've got like longer hair. And then I'd look down and my legs were like in longer, and I'd be wearing these different jeans. And like, so, we'd sort of have this fun. And that's why I just love it. I love the idea of there being a mystery person and wondering where they're from. And then having them from a different time can sort of force you to look at your own time with fresh eyes. Some people hated it, Claudine.
Oh, really?
The time travel people, yeah. It's funny. Like all the authors have said to me, don't go on Goodreads. And so I went on Goodreads. And it's funny, there's just a few people who say it was great, but then things went really crazy in the middle and I hated it. And it was so weird and it made me feel weird things. And that doesn't upset me at all. I'm really interested that people can really feel so viscerally about a story taking a turn that they weren't expecting. Yeah. They almost feel like they're being conned or tricked into reading one type of book and then having it turn into another. There's almost a form of like they feel insulted. And I don't think that's wrong. I'm just really interested by that. I'm really interested that if I were reading a book and then it sort of twisted a little bit in the middle, but then basically returned back to what I was expecting, why would I feel so cheated by that? So yeah, time traveling is definitely more divisive than I ever imagined it to be.
I think the millions upon millions of Outlander fans might not agree.
Oh my gosh, one of the best books ever. I still remember the first time I was like, oh, yeah.
Now, Ella, you just shared something quite personal with us, and I wanted to say thank you for sharing that. And also, are you okay?
Oh, yes, I'm really good. Thank you. I am 6 years past my diagnosis and in full remission. So it's a really lovely space to be. There's plenty of trauma, but we've all got trauma from all various different things. My mum had her second cancer a couple of years ago, and she's also in a really good spot. And we had dinner together the other night, and I gave her a big cuddle and said, imagine someone could show us this picture from when I was in 2018 or she was in 2022, and we were both in those awful initial weeks of diagnosis and fear and just terror. And I said, imagine if someone could just show us this picture of us giving each other a lovely big hug after a great dinner where we literally have not drawn breath for 3 hours, blah, 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 blah. And then she was walking home and I was driving off to my home. And I think, unfortunately, that is something that some people have to experience, through cancer or other types of awful stuff, is that it does give you the world's most extraordinary perspective shift. Don't get me wrong, I still crack it about my daughter putting the wrong dishwasher setting on, or my husband leaving his socks on the floor. But when it counts, having that perspective and that understanding and that appreciation of what you do have is genuinely invaluable.
And therein, you've just mentioned, like if you went back into 2018 and could show your 2018 self what you would look like in 2025, therein lies the premise of your book. That's time travel. I've often said this to my children. I've often said, I wish I could go back for one day where I could hold you again as an infant. One day when you were just born, or one day when you were 1 year old or 2 years. There's time travel. We have it in us. We all wish that we could do it. So I don't understand why people are so against it.
You're absolutely right. And then it can also work on the reverse. My grandma is still alive. She's 97 and she's in a nursing home, and she's in Point Lonsdale. And so I visit her, obviously. And I remember saying to her one sort of Saturday, and it was really sunny outside, her little balcony. And I said to her, Grandma, if you could be in my body right now, what would you do? And quick as a flash, she didn't even pause. She said, I'd walk on the beach. And she walks around the nursing home, but she sort of walk on the sand. And I mean, how's that? I tell you what, I've bloody enjoyed my next walk on the beach after that conversation. I really, really enjoyed it and soaked it up and took a million videos and sent them to her.
Ella, if there was one thing that you would like readers of the Cicada House to take away from it, what would that be?
I would love them to realize that it doesn't matter who you are, and I'm getting a bit meta because I'm being in the book, but also the author of the book. It doesn't matter if you're writing a book or if you're, traveling halfway across the world. It's observing those tiny moments, the senses, the smells, the tastes, the sounds. I'm not even going to go up into the lofty area of mindfulness. It's just about, it's amazing what a little bit of premature nostalgia will do for your happiness levels, So just like you just said, saying to your kids, oh, I just remember holding you as a 1-year-old. Also knowing that there's going to be a moment at which you will look back to this point now and remember them at 23 and wish that you could, I don't know, give them a kiss because they're still living at home or something. I'm not sure. But that's what I would love someone to take from this book, is realizing that nostalgia and magic is actually all around you every day. And you just have to shift your eyes a little bit and and see it.
Ella, you might know that there are lots of writers who listen into this podcast. And this is something I ask every author that I invite onto the podcast. I wondered if you had any tips for publishing success or for finishing their manuscript, anything that comes to mind that you think might be helpful.
I love how you asked this question. I think it's really good to the only reason I'm here is because I asked for help, and people are in this industry, they are endlessly generous. And so that is my tip. Don't be afraid to ask. I made a lot of connections on Instagram back in 2018 when I was sick. I was obviously spending a lot of time, I'd stopped work and I was spending a lot of time in treatment and basically just quite bored. And so I ended up making some connections with some amazing people who I hadn't actually met in person. And when I started to write, I really started to ask for help. For some people, I might ask for advice on could they read a piece that I'd written, or could they introduce me to someone that was in the publishing industry. And I don't know if I was starting out now, I don't know if I would be as brave to ask those questions. But I think the fact that I was in this bubble of treatment and the world was a very sort of strange place back then, I basically didn't care. I was like, the worst thing people can do is say no. And so I asked for help. And that would be my advice, is don't be afraid to just ask. As long as you ask with authenticity and with kindness and patience and understanding, then the worst thing that can happen is someone can say no. And what's interesting is that nearly every person that I've asked for help they've said, oh, I've got an essay that I wrote 5 years ago that got me, it was the first thing that ever got published. So I'll send it to you. I'll show you what my pitch looked like, or I'll introduce you to my agent and then they'll pass you on to someone. Every single person who has offered that level of generosity and time and help for me has always said the same thing, which is, it's totally fine. This is what someone did for me 5 years ago. And so it's this constant chain of paying it forward. And so if you are in that state of feeling guilty or embarrassed or maybe in a bit of shame to be asking something of someone, tell yourself that you will be in a position to pay it forward in the future. So, there's nothing wrong with starting now.
Are you working on something else at the moment?
Yes, and it's killing me. It's just, I can't crack it. And I've got the amazing advice from other, authors who have done many more amazing books and things. And they all say, just let it be, let it rumble around in the back of your head, something will pop up. But I think that what I'm starting to realize as I talk more about this book is the next idea that I had was set, the protagonist was a singing teacher and she lived in London and she had quite a big family. And the more I think about it, I think the reason why it's not really kicking off for me is there's nothing in there that I can really get my hooks into of my own observation. And you've nailed it today, Claudine, where you talked about, describing the sense and the senses. And I think that that's what I'm missing, is I need to find a way. I've got an idea for a story, which is a woman who is very, very, very good and very perfect. And then she does something very bad and very public. And it's that, and I really like that idea, but I think I need to change the framing around that to be something that's much closer to my own experience. So then I can really fall in love with the writing of the surroundings in the environment, because that's what gets me excited. So it's a very long answer to tell you that I have no bloody idea what I'm doing next, but I'm working on it.
Another very honest answer. Oh, Ella, I want to thank you for this beautiful book. I can't recommend it highly enough for lovers of magical, romantic, well-written stories. And I want to thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
It's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.